the world dissolved into a maelstrom of dust, shouting, and the percussive crack of gunfire. Ethan Vance felt the splintering wood of the bank teller's cage bite into his back as another bullet tore through the wall beside his head. Outside, the midday sun baked the main street of Redemption, turning the air into a shimmering, breathless furnace. Inside, it was a cavern of shadows and echoing chaos. "Vance the bags." The voice belonged to Silas Blackwood, a man who dressed like a gentleman, but whose soul was carved from gallows wood. He stood near the entrance, a silhouette of refined cruelty against the blinding glare of the street, his twin colts barking orders as much as bullets. Ethan's hands, clumsy with a fear he hadn't known since the war, fumbled with the canvas sacks. He was a rancher, not a thief. His palms were calloused from reins and fence posts, not the delicate mechanics of a safe tumbler, but Blackwood had left him no choice, left him no. "My family's debt. You said you'd forgive it." Ethan had argued days earlier in the opulent study of Blackwood's sprawling estate. Blackwood had smiled then, a cold reptilian curve of his lips. "Forgiveness is a currency, Mr. Vance, and its price is participation. You want to save your father's legacy? You will assist me in acquiring the capital to do so." It was a lie woven into a threat wrapped in the guise of an opportunity. Blackwood's railroad needed the land owned by the very bank he now intended to cripple. The debt was just leverage, a key to a lock of Ethan's own making. Now Ethan shoved bundles of currency into a sack, the paper feeling slick and foreign in his grasp. The bank manager lay groaning behind the counter, a dark stain spreading across his pristine white shirt. The clerk, a boy no older than 17, was curled into a ball beneath a desk, his whimpers lost in the cacophony. This wasn't justice. It wasn't even revenge. It was just brutal, ugly greed. "That's enough, let's go," Blackwood commanded, his voice cutting through the ringing in Ethan's ears. Ethan slung the heavy sacks over his shoulder and ran his boots skidding on scattered coins. They burst out into the street where Blackwood's men were holding back the town with a spray of covering fire. Horses stamped nervously at the hitching post, their eyes wide with panic. Ethan threw the bags across his saddle and swung himself up, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. This was the moment he could finally be free of Blackwood. They spurred their horses into a gallop, thundering out of Redemption, with a posse already forming in their wake. Dust plumed behind them, a choking brown cloud that swallowed the town whole. They rode hard for an hour, pushing the horses until their flanks were slick with sweat, and their breath came in ragged, heaving gasps. Finally, Blackwood raised a hand, pulling them to a halt in the shadow of a rock formation that clawed at the sky like a skeletal hand. "We split up here." Blackwood said, his chest rising and falling evenly, as if he'd just returned from a leisurely afternoon ride. He dismounted, his movements economical and precise. "The money will be laundered. You've done your part, Vance. Your debt is cleared." Relief so potent it was sickening washed over Ethan. He slumped in his saddle, the adrenaline leaving him weak and trembling. It was over. He could go home, salvage what was left of his family's ranch, and try to forget the face of the terrified boy under the desk. "Thank you," he managed to say, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Blackwood gave him that same cold smile. "Don't thank me. You've earned your freedom." He took a step closer, his hand extended as if for a handshake. But as Ethan reached out, Blackwood's other hand moved with blurring speed. It wasn't a gun. It was a fist that caught Ethan squarely on the jaw, sending him tumbling from his saddle to the cracked, unforgiving earth. His head struck a rock, and the world spun into a kaleidoscope of dizzying light and shadow. Before he could recover, Blackwood was on him, a knee pinning his chest. The man's face was inches from his, the polite mask gone, revealing the predator beneath. "Did you really think it was that simple?" Blackwood's voice was a low, venomous hiss. "You are a loose end, Mr. Vance. The son of Judge Alistair Vance. A man of principle. A man who might one day grow a conscience." He saw the glint of metal, then the dark eye of a revolver pressed against his shoulder. "A clean shot to the heart is too merciful," Blackwood murmured almost to himself. "But a wound that bleeds you out slowly in this godforsaken heat, that has a certain poetry to it." As the words registered, Ethan felt a sharp, searing pain in his shoulder as the gun roared. The force of the blast threw him back, and a cry of agony was ripped from his throat. Through a haze of pain, he saw Blackwood's hand move to his neck, his fingers closing not on his throat, but on the thin leather cord he always wore. With a sharp tug, the cord snapped. Blackwood held up the prize, a small silver locket tarnished with age and intricately engraved with the image of a single blooming rose. It swung gently from his fingers, catching the harsh sunlight. "No." Ethan gasped the word, a bubble of blood and despair. It was all he had left of her, of his late wife Eleanor. The locket held her portrait, a tiny, perfect image of her smile, the smile he saw in his dreams every night. "Please. Not that." "A pretty thing," Blackwood observed, his thumb rubbing over the engraving. "A memento. It will serve as a reminder to me of the day I finally settled my accounts with the Vance family." He slipped the locket into his waistcoat pocket. "Goodbye, Ethan. Give my regards to your father when you see him in hell." Blackwood turned and walked back to his horse, mounting with an unhurried grace. He gave a signal to his men, and they wheeled their horses around, disappearing over the rise without a backward glance. Ethan was left alone, the silence of the desert rushing in to replace the thunder of hooves. Pain was a living thing inside him, a white-hot poker driven through his shoulder. But it was nothing compared to the hollow, cavernous ache that opened in his chest. He had lost his wife to a fever 2 years ago. He had lost his ranch to debt. And now he had lost the last tangible piece of her memory to the man who had destroyed him. He had to get it back. The thought was a single flickering ember in the encroaching darkness of shock and blood loss. He didn't know how, but he couldn't die here. Not like this. Not while that monster carried his entire world in his pocket. Staggering to his feet, Ethan stumbled to his horse, which had shied away during the commotion, but hadn't bolted. He hauled himself into the saddle, a wave of black nausea washing over him. He didn't know where he was going, away from the direction Blackwood had taken, away from redemption and the law that would soon be hunting him. He rode blindly, aimlessly, a ghost, fleeing a nightmare. The sun beat down the cracked earth, stretched on forever, and the world slowly began to fray at the edges, his vision tunneling until all he could see was the memory of a silver locket swinging in the sun. He rode until he could no longer feel his hands on the reins, until the pain in his shoulder was a distant roaring fire, and until the horse, exhausted, finally stumbled to a halt. Ethan slid from the saddle, his body a dead weight. He crawled, driven by an instinct he didn't understand, toward a faint, distant shape. A house, a porch, a flicker of light behind a window. He collapsed onto the weathered wooden planks, the rough grain of the wood pressing against his cheek. The world went dark, but just before he surrendered to the abyss, one image burned behind his eyelids, the smiling face of his Eleanor trapped behind the silver rose. The blood soaked darker than Sarah McKenna expected, spreading across the weathered boards of her porch like spilled wine on a dusty floor. The man lying there was a study in stillness, save for the shallow, ragged breaths that hitched in his chest. His hat was gone, revealing dark hair matted with sweat and desert grit. A deep gash on his jaw bled sluggishly. Sarah held the heavy shotgun level, the stock pressed firm against her shoulder, though her arms ached with a trembling fatigue. Behind her, framed in the doorway, were her 3 sons, her whole world. Jake at 12 stood tallest, his face a mask of premature gravity. He was trying to be the man of the house, a burden far too heavy for his young shoulders. 8-year-old Sam clutched a small hand-carved wooden horse, his knuckles white with tension. And little Tommy, barely 5, peeked out from behind Jake's leg, his eyes wide, reflecting the fear that was a palpable presence in their small cabin. Ma Jake's voice was a low whisper, raspy with apprehension. "Stay inside, boys. All of you." Sarah commanded her tone, leaving no room for argument. It was the voice of a woman who had buried a husband 2 winters ago and had been fighting off the wolves of poverty and despair ever since. The man on the porch groaned, a raw sound of pure misery that seemed to tear at something inside her. He tried to shift, and the movement pulled his coat aside, revealing the source of the blood. A bullet hole, dark and ugly, puckered the fabric over his left shoulder. He was hurt badly, maybe dying, and she was pointing a gun at him. But a stranger in these parts was trouble more often than not, and Sarah had no margin for trouble. "Please." The word was a dry, cracked whisper, but it struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow. His eyes fluttered open, a startling pale blue, and they seemed to look right through her, into the weary depths of her own soul. "Water?" She hesitated, her finger tightening on the trigger. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to leave him. Let the desert claim him. To assume he was dangerous, that helping him would bring ruin down upon the fragile life she had built for her sons. But smart, safe choices had led her here to a failing farm with creditors from the railroad company circling like vultures and a winter looming that promised to be crueler than the last. Her gaze flickered to her boys. Jake's pants were too short. Sam's face was too thin. Tommy's quiet sobs in the night for the father he barely remembered were a constant aching refrain in her heart. "Ma, he's bleeding real bad," Jake said, his voice cutting through her turmoil. The man's gaze found Jake, and something in his expression softened a flicker of humanity in the mask of pain. "Good boys," he rasped. "Shouldn't have to see this." He tried to push himself up as if to crawl away and die somewhere more convenient, but the effort only sent a fresh surge of blood seeping through his fingers. That decided it. Sarah lowered the shotgun just enough to signal her intent. A choice born not of courage, but of a desperation that mirrored his own. Jake fetched the clean rags and the whiskey from the kitchen box. "Sam, bring the basin with water from the well," she ordered, her voice crisp and efficient. "Tommy, you stay put." The boys scattered, grateful for the purpose. Sarah knelt beside the stranger, the shotgun still within easy reach. Up close, the lines of hardship on his face were clearer. This was not a common drifter. There was a quality to him, a hint of a different life beneath the grime and blood. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice softer now as Jake returned with the supplies. He hesitated, his pale eyes searching hers as if weighing the cost of a name. "Cole," he said finally, the sound rough. "Cole Brennan." He winced as she began to clean the wound. "I know what you're thinking. The name's got paper on it from here to California. That I'm trouble." Sarah's hands stilled. She had heard the name whispered in town, a ghost associated with robberies and violence. But the man bleeding on her porch didn't look like a demon. He just looked broken. "The question is," he continued, his voice gaining a faint thread of strength, "what are you going to do about it? You could turn me in for the bounty. Or maybe we can help each other." His gaze was intense, unwavering. Sarah looked from his face to the barren fields beyond her, porch fields that should have been lush with corn, but were now parched and stunted by drought. She looked at the worn-out soles of her own boots at the fraying cuffs of her son's shirts. Everything was failing. Help each other, how she asked, her voice barely a whisper, though she already knew the shape of his offer. A faint, wry smile touched Cole's lips. Seems to me you've got a farm that needs a man's strength, boys who need a protector, and a winter coming that doesn't care how hard you work alone. I've got a powerful need to disappear for a while. To heal. He paused, letting the raw, brutal truth of their mutual desperation settle between them. You hide me? I'll work for you. I'll hunt. I'll fix what's broken. I'll make sure your boys don't go hungry. It was a devil's bargain, a pact with a shadow. To harbor a wanted man was to invite the law to her door, to risk everything. But she was already risking everything. Every day she woke up was a gamble against starvation. And when you're healed, she pressed, needing to know the full cost. When spring comes, you'll just ride away and leave us to face the trouble you brought. For the first time, a profound sadness clouded his eyes, a pain that had nothing to do with his wound. I won't lie to you, ma'am. I'm not the settling kind. But I give my word. You see me through this, and I'll see you and your boys through the winter. After that, we see where things stand. Sarah looked at her children, huddled together, their small faces etched with a fear that tore at her heart. Jake met her gaze, his expression solemn, trusting her to make the right choice. Sam shivered, wrapping his arms around himself. Tommy just watched her, his thumb finding its way to his mouth. Her choice wasn't about right and wrong anymore. It was about survival. She turned back to the wounded outlaw, to the man calling himself Cole Brennan, and made the only choice she could. All right, Cole Brennan, she said, her voice steady, belying the tremor in her soul. We have a deal. The relief that washed over his face was so profound, it was almost painful to witness. Thank you, he breathed. You won't regret this. I'd better not. Sarah replied, already shifting from negotiator to nurse. Jake, help me get him inside. Let's get him on the table. Together, they hauled the stranger to his feet. As they supported his weight, moving him into the sparse, clean cabin that was her home, Sarah felt the world tilt on its axis. She had just invited the devil in, praying he was the only one offering salvation. For 2 weeks, the outlaw in her barn was more phantom than man. Ethan, or Cole, as he insisted on being called, drifted in a fever dream, his body fighting the infection that had set into his wound. Sarah cleaned and dressed it tirelessly, using the last of her poultice herbs and feeding him thin broth he barely seemed to register. The boys watched from a distance, a mixture of fear and fascination in their eyes. He was their secret, a dangerous creature they kept hidden in the hayloft. Slowly, the fever broke. Color returned to his face, and the haunted look in his pale eyes was replaced by a sharp, weary intelligence. He began to eat, to speak in sentences rather than fevered mumbles. And as his strength returned, so did the terms of their bargain. He insisted on working, starting with small repairs Sarah could no longer manage, mending the harness, sharpening the axe, reinforcing a loose board in the porch. His hands, she noticed, were not those of a career outlaw. They were strong and calloused, familiar with the rhythms of hard labor. He moved with a quiet competence that was both reassuring and unsettling. Who was this man, really? The first test of their fragile alliance arrived on a crisp autumn morning in the form of 2 men on horseback. They weren't lawmen. They were dressed in the practical, dusty attire of surveyors, carrying tripods and measuring chains. Morning, ma'am, the taller one called out, his smile not reaching his cold, watchful eyes. We're with the Transcontinental Railroad. Just surveying the pass. Your property line runs right through our proposed route. Sarah's heart sank. These were the men her late husband had warned her about, the men from the company that held the lien on her farm. Cole, who had been splitting firewood near the barn, instantly went still. He'd seen them coming long before she had. With a nearly imperceptible movement, he faded back into the shadows of the barn, disappearing from view. My husband made it clear the farm wasn't for sale. Sarah said, wiping her hands on her apron, her voice firmer than she felt. Your husband's gone, Mrs. McKenna, the second man said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. Things change. The company's prepared to make you a fair offer, enough to set you and the boys up fresh somewhere else. This is our home. We're not leaving, she stated flatly. The first man's smile vanished. This is a wild country, ma'am. A widow with 3 young boys. It's a hard life. Accidents happen, fires, cattle wander off. It'd be a shame if something unfortunate were to happen before you reconsidered our generous offer. The threat hung in the air, as sharp and cold as a winter wind. From the shadows of the barn, Sarah could feel Cole's presence, a coiled spring of silent, watchful tension. She knew he had his pistol. She knew that if these men pushed any harder, the quiet morning would erupt in violence, and their secret would be exposed to the world. Drawing herself up to her full height, Sarah met the man's gaze without flinching. Is that a threat? He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Just an observation, ma'am. The world is a dangerous place. He tipped his hat. We'll be back. They rode off, leaving behind a silence thick with menace. A moment later, Cole emerged from the barn, his face grim, his hand resting near the Colt, holstered at his hip. They work for Silas Blackwood, he said, his voice a low growl. Sarah turned to him confused. How do you know that name? Because men like that are his signature. Cole answered, his eyes, distant, fixed on the riders disappearing over the ridge. He offered no more explanation, and Sarah didn't ask. The encounter changed things. The threat was no longer an abstract worry about creditors. It was a physical presence that had stood in her yard. That night, Cole moved his bedroll from the barn to the corner of the main cabin near the door. Just until they understand this land is protected, he said, avoiding her eyes. He wasn't just a hired hand anymore. He was a guardian. He began to teach Jake how to handle his father's rifle, not as a toy, but as a tool for hunting and defense. His patience was endless, his instruction gentle but firm. You don't point it at anything you don't intend to kill, he'd say, his hands guiding Jake's stance. Sight, breathe, squeeze. Don't ever jerk the trigger. Under Cole's tutelage, Jake's adolescent awkwardness began to transform into a quiet confidence. With Sam, who was quieter and more introspective, Cole found a different connection. He showed him how to track animals, how to read the clouds for signs of rain, how to listen to the language of the wilderness. He taught him how to carve, and soon Sam's pockets were filled with misshapen but beloved wooden birds and rabbits. For Tommy, Cole became a hero. He would hoist the small boy onto his good shoulder, telling him grand stories of mythical cowboys and brave explorers. His presence filled the hollow spaces in their lives, patching the holes left by Robert's absence with a steady, quiet strength. A deep, unspoken bond began to form between Cole and Sarah. They worked together in a rhythm of shared purpose, falling into the patterns of a husband and wife. He would anticipate her needs, a bucket of water brought from the well before she asked a rickety fence post mended before it could fall. She in turn began to see past the wanted outlaw to the man beneath. She saw the profound sadness that sometimes clouded his eyes when he thought no one was watching, the gentleness in his hands when he patched Tommy's scraped knee. One afternoon, on a necessary trip to town for flour and salt, Sarah's world tilted again. Hiding in the back issues of the local newspaper at the general store, she found what she was subconsciously looking for. A faded article from 2 years prior out of Topeka. It detailed a horrific fire at the Vance Ranch. Judge Alistair Vance and his wife, had perished. Their only son, Ethan Vance, a former cavalry officer, had survived, but lost his wife Eleanor to a fever shortly after. He had sold the ruined property and disappeared. The article included a smudged sketch of Ethan Vance. The jawline, the set of the eyes, it was him. It was Cole. Her outlaw wasn't Cole Brennan. He was Ethan Vance, a man who had lost everything. The bank robbery, the desperation, it all started to make a terrible, tragic sense. That night, as they sat in the quiet of the cabin after the boys were asleep, Sarah found the courage to speak. "I saw a drawing of you in an old newspaper," she said softly. "It said your name was Ethan." He didn't flinch, didn't deny it. He simply stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his pale eyes. After a long silence, he spoke. "My wife, Eleanor. She loved roses," he began, his voice thick with memory. "She wore a silver locket one I gave her. It had a rose engraved on the front." He paused, swallowing hard. "The man who shot me. The man who runs the railroad that wants your land. He took it from me. It was all I had left of her." The confession was raw, intimate, a piece of his soul laid bare. Sarah felt a wave of empathy so powerful it stole her breath. This wasn't about a criminal hiding from the law. This was about a shattered man hunting for the last piece of his past. The fight for her land and his quest for redemption were now inextricably linked. Their bargain had become something far more dangerous and far more profound. The wolf arrived at her doorstep on a Sunday, dressed in the fine wool of a gentleman. Silas Blackwood dismounted from a sleek black stallion, his movements fluid and confident. He carried no visible weapon, but his presence was more menacing than any drawn gun. The two surveyors flanked him at a respectful distance. Cole was in the barn with Jake mending a saddle. Through a crack in the weathered planks, he saw Blackwood approach the cabin, and his blood ran cold. He pulled Jake back into the deepest shadows, his hand a silent command for stillness. Mrs. McKenna Blackwood said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone, as Sarah stepped onto the porch, the shotgun held loosely in her hands. "Silas Blackwood, I apologize for my men's abruptness the other day. I prefer to handle delicate matters personally." He smiled, a predatory gleam in his dark eyes. "I've come to make you a final offer. One I assure you is more than generous. I'm a businessman, not a monster. I simply want what is best for progress and for you and your lovely children." Sarah stood her ground, her face a stony mask. "I've already given your men my answer." "Ah, but you hadn't heard my offer," Blackwood purred. He named a sum that made Sarah's breath catch. It was enough money to start over anywhere, to give her boys a life free from hardship. It was a devil's temptation presented with a silver tongue. "This land is not for sale." She repeated, her knuckles white on the shotgun. Blackwood's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the edges. "A pity." He reached into his waistcoat pocket ostensibly for a handkerchief to dab at his brow. "The sun is quite unforgiving out here." As he pulled out a fine silk handkerchief, something else came with it, falling from his pocket with a soft clink onto the porch boards. It was small silver and attached to a broken leather cord. A silver locket engraved with a single blooming rose. Time seemed to stop. Sarah's eyes widened, recognizing it instantly from Cole's description. In the barn, Ethan felt the air leave his lungs in a silent gasp. The world narrowed to that single small object lying in the dust. It was a deliberate act, a message. "I know you're here, I know who you are, and I have what you hold most dear." Blackwood feigned surprise. "Oh, clumsy of me." He bent down and picked it up, polishing it with his thumb before looking directly at Sarah, his gaze sharp and meaningful. Just a trifle, a memento from a past business dealing. He slipped it back into his pocket. Think about my offer, Mrs. McKenna. I will expect your answer within the week. He turned and strode back to his horse, every line of his body radiating triumphant cruelty. He had just turned their sanctuary into a cage. When he was gone, Ethan stumbled out of the barn, his face ashen, the color drained from his lips. He stared at the spot on the porch where the locket had fallen, his expression one of pure, unadulterated hatred. He knows, Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse. That monster, he knows I'm here. The game had changed. This was no longer just about hiding from the law or protecting a widow's farm. It was personal. The man who had shot him, stolen the last remnant of his wife, and was now threatening to destroy this new family he had come to love, was one and the same. The fight was no longer for survival. It was for vengeance. Blackwood's visit marked the beginning of a siege. He no longer bothered with polite offers. The next time Sarah went to town, she found her line of credit at the general store had been revoked. Orders from the railroad's bank, the proprietor told her, his eyes full of pity. My hands are tied, Sarah. A few nights later, they were awakened by the frantic lowing of their few cattle. Ethan and Jake rushed out with lanterns to find the fence cut and their small herd scattered, driven off into the darkness by riders who left no tracks. They spent 2 days rounding up what they could, but 2 cows, their main source of milk and future income, were gone for good. They were being systematically isolated, starved out. The world was shrinking, the walls of their mountain refuge closing in. The fear was a constant, unwelcome guest at their dinner table. Sam grew quieter again, clutching his wooden horse for comfort. Tommy started having nightmares, crying out in his sleep. But the pressure did not break them. It forged them into something stronger. They became a unit, a small, defiant clan, holding out against a ruthless king. Ethan taught Sarah and Jake how to set snares, and they supplemented their dwindling supplies with rabbits and squirrels. They reinforced the cabin, boarding up the smaller windows and creating strategic firing positions. They were no longer just a family. They were a garrison. In the quiet moments between the work and the worry, the bond between Ethan and Sarah deepened into a love that was fierce and tender. It was a love born of shared crisis, a silent understanding that they were all each other had left in the world. One night, as a cold rain drummed against the roof, she found him on the porch, staring out into the oppressive darkness, his shoulders slumped with the weight of it all. This is my fault, he said, his voice heavy with guilt. I brought this down on you, on your boys. Sarah came and stood beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. You didn't bring him here, Ethan. He was already coming for this land. You just gave us a fighting chance. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. We're in this together. He turned to her, his pale eyes shining in the dim light from the cabin window. He saw not pity or blame, but strength and unwavering loyalty. He saw a partner. He saw a future he hadn't dared to dream of. He leaned in and kissed her a kiss that was not of passion, but of profound gratitude and desperate hope. In that moment, they were not a widow and an outlaw. They were just a man and a woman standing together against the storm. And the storm was coming. They could feel it in the air, a gathering darkness on the horizon that had nothing to do with the weather. The storm broke with the fury of a vengeful god. Rain fell in solid, wind-driven sheets, turning the yard into a quagmire of slick red mud. Lightning spiderwebbed across the black sky, each flash illuminating the world in stark, ghostly detail, followed by cannonades of thunder that shook the very foundations of the cabin. It was the perfect night for an attack. They came just after midnight, a dozen riders emerging from the tempest, like specters. Ethan saw them first, a flicker of movement by the tree line during a flash of lightning. "They're here," he said, his voice grimly calm. The cabin instantly transformed into a fortress. Sarah herded Sam and Tommy into the root cellar, its earthen walls the safest place in the house. "Stay here no matter what you hear," she commanded, her voice betraying none of the terror that clawed at her throat. "Sam, you're in charge of your brother." Jake, his face pale but his jaw set with determination, took up his position at a side window, his father's rifle resting on the sill. He was no longer a boy playing at being a man. He was a soldier defending his home. Ethan stood by the main door, his Colt steady in his hand, his mind a cold, calculating machine, assessing angles and odds. Sarah took the shotgun, stationing herself at the kitchen window that overlooked the barn. The first shots exploded from the darkness, splintering the log walls of the cabin. Glass shattered. The assault was brutal and direct, a show of overwhelming force designed to terrify and subdue. McKenna Blackwood's voice roared over the storm, amplified by the wind. "Vance, I know you're in there. The offer is withdrawn. Surrender the man, and I will let the children live." "He's lying," Ethan shouted back to Sarah and Jake over the din. "He can't leave witnesses." The fight began in earnest. It was a desperate tactical battle against impossible odds. Ethan had spent days preparing for this moment. He had memorized every rock, every dip in the terrain. He returned fire with deadly accuracy, not aiming to kill, but to pin them down, to make them waste ammunition, to make them believe the cabin was more heavily defended than it was. Lightning flashed, and Sarah saw a man trying to flank the house, creeping toward the barn. She raised the shotgun, took a deep breath as Cole had taught her, and fired. The buckshot tore through the rain, and the man screamed, falling back into the mud. She felt no triumph, only a sick, cold certainty that she had just crossed a line from which she could never return. For an hour, the battle raged. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and rain. Then came the moment Ethan had dreaded. From his window, Jake saw one of Blackwood's men break cover, making a run for the back of the house where there was a blind spot. He was exposed, an easy target. Jake raised the rifle, his eye finding the sight. He had the man dead to rights. His finger tightened on the trigger. He had shot rabbits, deer, but never a person. In that split second, frozen in a flash of lightning, his face was a portrait of agonizing conflict. He was 12 years old, and he was about to take a human life to protect his family. Jake knew Ethan's voice was sharp. He fired his own pistol not at the man, but at the ground near his feet. The running figure scrambled back into the darkness. Ethan looked at Jake, whose face was crumbling, the rifle shaking in his hands. "Not you, son. This isn't your fight to finish. Not like that." Just then, a new sound cut through the storm, the roar of fire. Blackwood's men had thrown torches onto the barn roof. Dry hay and old timber caught instantly, and brilliant orange flames erupted, clawing at the night sky, casting the entire farm in a hellish dancing light. "They're trying to burn us out," Sarah cried. "We have to move." The tunnel, Ethan set his mind racing. To the root cellar. Now. He laid down covering fire while Sarah pulled a stunned Jake from the window. They scrambled into the cramped, musty darkness of the root cellar, just as the cabin's porch roof began to smolder. Ethan slammed the heavy cellar door shut and barred it from the inside. They were trapped, but for the moment safe from the flames. In the suffocating dark, with the sounds of the fire and the storm raging above them, huddled with the woman and children he had come to love, Ethan finally let the last of his walls crumble. "My real name is Ethan Vance." He confessed, the words rushing out of him in the darkness. "My father was Judge Alistair Vance. He was a hard man, but an honest one. Years ago, he presided over a bankruptcy case. A young landowner who had overextended got caught in a financial collapse. My father ruled against him, followed the letter of the law. The man lost everything. His family was ruined. He took a ragged breath. That man was Silas Blackwood. He spent years building himself back up, nursing a grudge that festered into a generational vendetta. The bank robbery and redemption. It wasn't about the money. It was about forcing me, my father's son, to commit a crime. It was about destroying my name, my honor, before he killed me. It was all revenge. Sarah listened her hand, finding his in the dark. The final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The cruelty, the stolen locket, the relentless pursuit, it was all born from a twisted, obsessive hatred. Suddenly, the cellar door above them, splintered, kicked in by a heavy boot. Light from the burning barn flooded the space. Silas Blackwood stood silhouetted in the doorway, a revolver in his hand, his face a mask of triumphant fury. "The end of the line, Vance." He snarled, his eyes wild in the firelight. "Your father took my legacy. Now I take his." He raised the pistol, aiming it directly at Ethan's heart. But before he could fire, a small figure launched itself from the shadows. Jake, armed with a heavy piece of firewood, swung it with all his might against Blackwood's gun hand. The pistol clattered to the floor. Blackwood roared in pain and fury, backhanding Jake so hard the boy flew across the small cellar. That was all the opening Ethan needed. He surged forward, tackling Blackwood and driving him back out into the maelstrom of rain and fire. They crashed into the mud, a desperate tangle of limbs. It was no longer a gunfight. It was a primal brawl. Ethan's grief and rage against Blackwood's decades of festering hate. Ethan gained the upper hand, his fists finding their mark, fueled by the image of Jake flying through the air, of Sarah's terrified face, of Eleanor's locket in this monster's pocket. He had Blackwood pinned, his hands around the man's throat, the desire for final lethal justice overwhelming him. And then he saw it. Dangling from Blackwood's waistcoat, illuminated by the fire, was the silver locket. He stopped, his grip loosening. Killing Blackwood wouldn't bring Eleanor back. It would only make him the monster Blackwood had always wanted him to be. It would make him unworthy of the new family he fought to protect. At that moment, a new sound cut through the chaos, the urgent ringing of a bell and the shouts of approaching riders. Someone had seen the fire. Help was coming. Ethan stood up, pulling a gasping, battered Blackwood to his feet, just as Sheriff Bradley and a posse of townsmen rode into the ravaged yard, with their faces grim in the flickering firelight. Blackwood saw them, and a cunning smile spread across his bruised lips. "Sheriff," he choked out. "Thank God this man, the outlaw Cole Brennan, he attacked this poor family. I was just trying to help." Ethan looked at the arriving lawmen, then back at Sarah and the boys emerging from the cellar. He had a choice. He could run, grab a horse, and disappear into the night forever, a fugitive. Or he could stay and face the consequences of his past, whatever they might be. He let go of Blackwood. He slowly unbuckled his gun belt and let it drop into the mud. He raised his empty hands. "My name is Ethan Vance," he said, his voice clear and steady above the storm. "And I surrender." The trial of Silas Blackwood was the talk of the territory. It unfolded not in a grand courthouse, but in the converted saloon in Redemption, and the entire town packed inside, drawn by the drama of the powerful man's fall. The falling action of Ethan's life, played out on a public stage, his fate hanging in the balance. Sheriff Bradley had been thorough. The two captured members of Blackwood's gang, faced with hanging, had sung like canaries, detailing years of intimidation, racketeering, and violence, all orchestrated by their employer in his quest to build his railroad empire. The bank manager from Redemption testified that Ethan had seemed reluctant, forced into the robbery. But the star witness was Sarah McKenna. She stood before the circuit judge, her voice clear and unwavering, her simple dignity silencing the crowded room. She told them everything. About a wounded man collapsing on her porch, about a bargain born of desperation, about the man who had protected her children, taught her son to be a man, and stood between her family and a monster, knowing it would likely cost him his life. She spoke not of an outlaw named Cole Brennan, but of a good and broken man named Ethan Vance. When she finished, there was a profound silence. Ethan watched her from the defendant's chair, his heart aching with a love and gratitude so immense it felt like it might break him open. In the end, justice, like the Western landscape, was a thing of harsh and simple clarity. Silas Blackwood was found guilty on multiple counts of attempted murder, arson, and conspiracy. His refined cruelty finally stripped away, he was nothing more than a bitter, defeated man sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. Ethan's case was more complex. He had participated in a bank robbery. He had resisted arrest, even if that arrest was by illegal bounty hunters. But the judge, a pragmatic man who understood the shades of gray that colored life on the frontier, was swayed by the testimony and the evidence of coercion. He cleared Ethan of the most serious charges, but could not ignore the law entirely. Ethan Vance, the judge, declared, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "Your path has been a difficult one. You have paid a heavy price for mistakes, both yours and others. While this court finds you not guilty of robbery, you are not entirely without fault. For your association with known criminals, I sentence you to 1 year of service at the territorial prison. A symbolic sentence. A chance to wipe the slate clean. A year. It felt like a lifetime and a mercy all at once. As the deputies led him away, his eyes met Sarah's across the room. No words were needed. Her look was a promise, I will wait. That year was the longest of his life, but it was also a time of healing. He worked, he reflected, and he allowed the wounds of his past, the fire, the loss of Eleanor, the betrayal, to finally begin to scar over. He received letters from Sarah every week, filled with news of the farm and the boys. Jake had taken charge of the rebuilding, his confidence growing daily. Sam had discovered a talent for gardening, coaxing a surprising bounty from the stubborn earth. Tommy was learning to read his letters, big and clumsy, always ending with a drawing of their family, which now included a stick figure labeled Cole. Sarah, with the help of neighbors who now saw her as a local hero, had managed to save the farm. The money from Blackwood's estate, seized by the government, had been used in part to settle all outstanding liens in the valley. The land was finally indisputably hers. The day of his release came on a bright, cool morning in early autumn. He walked out of the prison gates, a free man dressed in a simple set of clothes Sarah had sent him. She was there waiting for him with a wagon. She looked older, her face etched with the hardships of the past year, but her eyes shone with a strength and love that took his breath away. The ride home was quiet, a comfortable silence filled with everything that didn't need to be said. As they crested the last hill and the farm came into view, rebuilt and whole, Ethan felt a sense of homecoming he hadn't known since he was a boy. The boys came running out to meet the wagon, shouting his name. Tommy launched himself into his arms, followed by a more reserved but equally emotional hug from Sam. Jake stood back, trying to maintain his newfound maturity, but the wide grin on his face betrayed him. He shook Ethan's hand, a firm man-to-man grip of respect and welcome. That evening, the cabin was filled with the warm, comforting sounds of a family reunited. After dinner, as the boys settled down with their chores, Ethan walked to the mantelpiece. Sheriff Bradley had returned his possessions to Sarah after the trial. She retrieved a small cloth-wrapped object from a drawer and handed it to him. His fingers trembling slightly, unwrapped the cloth. There it was, the silver locket. He clicked it open. Eleanor's tiny portrait smiled up at him, her image as bright and clear as it was in his memory. For a long moment he simply looked at it, a silent farewell to the ghost he had chased for so long. He had made peace with his past, not by forgetting it, but by accepting it as part of the man he had become. With a sense of quiet ceremony, he placed the locket on the mantel. It was a piece of his history, a tribute to a love that had shaped him. As he set it down, he noticed something new beside it. A crayon drawing carefully tacked to the wooden wall. It was Tommy's latest work. It depicted 5 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. A woman, 3 boys of varying heights, and a man. Their home. He looked from the portrait in the locket to the crayon drawing of his new family. The past and the future side by side. He felt Sarah's presence behind him, her hand resting gently on his back. He was no longer Ethan Vance, the grieving survivor, nor was he Cole Brennan, the desperate outlaw. He was just Ethan, a husband, a father, a man who had walked through fire and found his way home.